What was going on in the studio, though, was a real tug of war about taste and how to do it. It wasn't just the movie, it was also we didn't agree about,
Paul Simon's sweet melodies hit a sharp edge, and when it came to certain musicians, his dislike was brutal. Behind the genius of Bridge Over Troubled Water and his solo masterpieces, Simon carried grudges and rivalries that shocked even the music world. From public spats to behind-the-scenes bitterness, he wasn't afraid to burn bridges. Here are the top 6 musicians Paul Simon hated the most. Ed Sheeran. Paul Simon had always respected the grind. He knew what it meant to play to half-empty clubs, to carry songs like Fragile Secrets from one smoky bar to the next, slowly chiseling away at something honest until it finally took shape. When he looked at Ed Sheeran's rise from busking on the streets of London to selling out stadiums, Simon couldn't help but acknowledge the hustle. That part he respected. The road is long, and only a few survive it. But admiration stopped there. For Simon, what he couldn't stomach was replication disguised as reverence. He heard echoes of his own work in Sheeran's early catalog, finger-picked guitars, tender melodies, lyrical intimacy, but stripped of the bruises, the scars that had given Simon and Garfunkel's music its weight. He once told a confidant that Ed's songs sounded like Simon and Garfunkel without the pain. The line wasn't delivered with jealousy, but with grief. Grief for what he felt music was becoming. At first, Simon let it go. After all, youth copies. Every generation borrows from the last, and imitation is often the raw clay from which originality emerges. But the moment shifted from forgivable mimicry to something more personal when Ed name-dropped Simon in a track, positioning him as a blueprint, a compass in the landscape of modern songwriting. The world might have seen it as a tribute, but for Simon, it twisted like a knife. He didn't feel honored. He felt used. To be framed as a decorative influence, reduced to a reference point in someone else's narrative, was not the kind of legacy Simon had worked for. His songs weren't designed to be ornamental. They were carved out of private wounds, sharpened by scars and tensions. To see that distilled into a casual nod in pop culture felt like erasure, as though the struggle behind his music could be flattened into a name check. His response was quiet, but deliberate. He made calls, instructing his team to block any joint interview requests. He asked festival bookers to avoid placing them on the same lineups. It wasn't about theatrics or public statements. Simon never needed spectacle to register disapproval. "I'm not his compass," he muttered once, more to himself than anyone else, a quiet rejection of the idea that his artistry could be boiled down to a directional marker for a younger star. Privately, Simon wrestled with what Sheeran's rise represented. To him, it signaled a dangerous cultural shift, music without tension, storytelling without scars. Sheeran's songs were catchy, yes, even clever, but they seemed to Simon like sketches without shadows, stories without blood under the fingernails. They were polished, digestible, and endlessly marketable, but they lacked the kind of raw fracture that made music feel necessary. It wasn't personal, until it was. Until Simon felt the weight of being pulled into another man's narrative, reduced to a line in a song rather than the architect of a lifetime's work. That was the moment it became less about culture and more about dignity. Simon had spent decades resisting being defined by trends, by other people's projections, by easy comparisons. To become a footnote in Ed Sheeran's pop saga was, for him, intolerable. And so, like with others before him, Simon chose silence as his answer. No feud, no public shots, just absence. He removed himself from the possibility of being cast as mentor or co-signer. For Paul Simon, the legacy he had built was not to be borrowed wholesale, not to be flattened into reverence without weight. If Ed Sheeran wanted to tell stories, let him tell his own. Madonna Paul Simon had never shied away from boldness. In fact, he admired it. To put oneself on the line in song, to reveal private pain, to risk ridicule, that was, to him, the essence of artistry. But boldness without vulnerability was theater. Boldness packaged for mass consumption was something else entirely, and in Madonna, Simon saw exactly that. From the outside, her rise was dazzling. She broke boundaries, redefined stardom, blurred the lines between music, fashion, and provocation. But to Simon's eyes, it was all too neatly calculated. Off the record, he once accused her of selling rebellion like soda pop, taking the language of pain and turning it into product, transforming shock into strategy. He didn't begrudge her fame. He simply disliked what fame, in her hands, did to truth. Where he saw music as a vessel for confession, Madonna's work struck him as a billboard, bright, striking, but ultimately advertising an image more than revealing a soul. For Simon, her evolution over the years, from downtown provocateur to global icon, was not growth, but marketing. Each transformation felt like another campaign, another strategy session. To him, it was a performance of revolution sanitized for prime time, rebellion stripped of its danger and fitted for broadcast. She was undeniably powerful, but in Simon's mind, power without vulnerability was artifice. Their worlds intersected only rarely, and when they did, the tension was palpable. One such moment came at a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremony. The room itself was buzzing with legacy, flash bulbs popping, champagne glasses clinking, the air heavy with self-congratulation. Legends milled about, all aware they were part of history in motion. It was in this swirl of spectacle that Madonna approached Paul Simon. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to adoration. Her smile was immaculate, almost political in its precision. Her posture was perfect, her charm calculated for maximum effect. She extended warmth as if it were another accessory in her arsenal, something she could wear for the moment and discard when the cameras turned away. Simon responded, but only out of courtesy. He extended his hand, met her gaze, but offered no more. Their handshake was brief, the energy lopsided, the tension between them louder than any of the speeches echoing through the hall. In that instant, Simon noticed something telling. How quickly her focus shifted from him to the crowd, to the flash of cameras, to the wider audience. He realized he was not part of a conversation. He was a prop in her performance. What he felt was not rage, not even disdain, but something colder, disillusionment. That fleeting moment didn't just confirm his suspicions about her, it confirmed something deeper about himself. In a world that worshipped spectacle and artifice, the kind of authenticity he had spent his career pursuing felt like an artifact from another time. He stood in that hall surrounded by glitz and applause, and felt, perhaps for the first time, out of step with the culture his own music had helped shape. Later, someone asked him what he and Madonna had talked about. He answered simply, "Nothing." And in a way, that was the most honest thing about the entire exchange. Because between Paul Simon and Madonna, there had never really been dialogue. Only the silence of two philosophies brushing against each other for a moment, one rooted in scars, the other in spectacle, and then drifting apart again as if they had never truly belonged in the same room. Sting. For much of their careers, Paul Simon and Sting were spoken of in the same breath. Both were hailed as literate songwriters, masters of words and melody who carried a certain intellectual gravitas in a pop landscape often ruled by flash. They were often booked at the same festivals, mentioned together in interviews, even positioned as parallel figures, two poets of their generation. But beneath the surface of this pairing simmered an unspoken tension. For Simon, whose best work came from deep wells of personal experience, the comparison was more curse than compliment. Where his own songs were born of scars and private reckonings, Sting's carried an unmistakable sheen. To Simon, there was something staged about it all. The immaculate phrasing, the yoga-inflected serenity, the way Sting seemed to project not just music, but a philosophy of living. It struck him as performance more than revelation. If Simon's art was raw confession, Sting's felt like theater. The divide was not one of talent, but of truth. Paul once remarked to a colleague, "Sting sings like he's solving a riddle for applause." It was a line that captured his irritation perfectly. Sting's music to him seemed clever in all the wrong ways, dressed up in intellectual polish, but divorced from bruises, from the kind of pain that made music necessary. To Simon, authenticity wasn't about control, it was about vulnerability, the risk of imperfection, the crack in the voice that revealed something real. Sting, by contrast, seemed to chase perfection as if it were the point. Their paths crossed publicly in 2002 at a high-profile benefit gala. Sting, ever the showman, suggested a duet, lightening the mood with a wry line into the microphone. Two poets, just one microphone. The audience laughed, and Simon smiled too. But behind the smile was something closer to disdain. He went along with the performance, offering professionalism on stage, but the moment lingered in his mind long after the applause faded. That night, alone in his hotel room, Simon scribbled furiously into a notebook. Not lyrics, not drafts for a new song, just jagged notes, fragments of thought, a private attempt to exorcise the irritation. By morning, his decision was firm. He declined all future collaborative offers with Sting, quietly but definitively. No public feud, no grand declaration, just a silent wall erected between them. For Simon, the irritation had never been jealousy. It was disappointment. Sting represented something he had spent his career resisting. The transformation of music into performance, of vulnerability into calculation, of artistry into brand. Simon's rejection of Sting was not explosive, but absolute. They moved in similar orbits, continued to be compared in articles and retrospectives, yet never again sought each other's company. For Sting, the silence may have meant nothing at all. Perhaps he chalked it up to Simon's introversion or eccentricity. For Simon, though, the silence said everything. He believed that music was a language carved out of wounds, a way of making sense of pain and memory. To see it rendered into something choreographed, polished for applause, felt to him like betrayal. And so, he kept his distance. There was no need for arguments, no need for public put-downs. Sometimes, the loudest rejection is absence. Bob Dylan. For Paul Simon, like so many young musicians coming of age in the 1960s, Bob Dylan was not just another songwriter. He was a revelation. Dylan's lyrics seemed to exist on a different plane, filled with surreal imagery, riddles, and abstractions that felt closer to poetry than pop. His presence carried an aura of mystery, as if he had somehow tapped into a deeper current of truth inaccessible to ordinary artists. For Simon, who had grown up admiring careful melody and tightly structured lyricism, Dylan's songs seemed like scripture, cryptic verses to be studied, decoded, and emulated. He once admitted to poring over Dylan's records with both awe and a quiet envy, wondering how anyone could bend words and melody into something that felt so timeless yet so raw. But reverence rarely survives first contact. When Simon finally found himself in the same rooms as Dylan, the pedestal cracked. Whatever Simon had built in his imagination, a kinship between two great songwriters, perhaps even a mentor-like bond, was quickly undone by Dylan's demeanor. Dylan was not warm, not generous with praise, and certainly not inclined to reassure fellow musicians. To Paul, who carried both a competitive streak and a sensitive heart, Dylan's aloofness felt like deliberate dismissal. One moment in particular cut deeper than most. At a party, Simon overheard Dylan mutter "too clever" about his music. It wasn't shouted, nor even directed at him, but it was loud enough to sting. For Simon, it wasn't simply criticism, it was erasure. The words echoed in his mind for days. Cleverness, after all, was Simon's currency. His tightly woven rhymes, his intricate melodies, his precise, intellectual craftsmanship. To have Dylan reduce it to a flaw felt like being told his very essence was hollow. Simon had come seeking validation, maybe even camaraderie, and instead, he left feeling like an outsider in the one circle where he longed to belong. Over time, admiration curdled into rivalry. Simon began to view Dylan less as a beacon and more as a shadow looming over his career, refusing to acknowledge him as an equal. In public, their exchanges turned into a subtle Cold War. Simon, usually mild-mannered, couldn't resist mocking Dylan's nasal drawl in interviews, a small rebellion against the man whose approval he had once craved. Dylan, for his part, was dismissive in his own way, brushing off Simon's songwriting as neat in a bad way, as if Simon's precision was the opposite of authenticity. These were not direct insults hurled across a battlefield, but quieter barbs, words sharpened into ice picks, leaving wounds that didn't quite heal. Privately, Simon confided to friends that he believed Dylan's mystique was little more than performance art. The ragged clothes, the evasive interviews, the air of untouchable genius, it was, in Simon's eyes, a carefully constructed shadow with a harmonica. Dylan, he felt, was not as unknowable as he pretended, and the act itself struck Simon as inauthentic. Coming from a man who valued the polish of craft and the honesty of melody, this realization was its own kind of betrayal. The great disappointment of Paul Simon's artistic life was not that Dylan disliked him. It was that Simon had once needed Dylan's approval so profoundly. That hunger, that yearning to be recognized by the man he admired most, only to be met with silence and indifference, left a scar that never fully faded. Simon's rivalry with Dylan was never just professional. It was personal, rooted in the painful truth that his idol would never see him as an equal. And so, what began in reverence ended in quiet resentment. Two of the greatest songwriters of their generation, forever linked in history, but bound not by friendship or mutual respect, but by a cold distance and the lingering ache of words left unsaid. Art Garfunkel. They began as boys, singing in stairwells and schoolyards, their voices fusing so seamlessly that it seemed less like harmony and more like destiny. Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel were brothers in song, brothers in ambition, brothers in the fragile magic of youth. Together they built cathedrals out of sound, their voices rising with a purity that could hush a room and fill it with something close to reverence. For a time, the bond felt sacred, unbreakable. But behind beauty often lies tension, and theirs was no exception. As their fame grew, so did the friction. Quiet resentments, unspoken rivalries, egos bruised by decisions and absences. Creative control became a battlefield. Art's soaring tenor may have defined their sound, but it was Paul's pen that built the foundation, line by line, chord by chord. That imbalance between voice and vision created a wound that never fully closed. The silences between them became sharper than arguments, cutting deeper than any insult could. Simon didn't just resent Garfunkel's choices, he resented what those choices did to his memories. When Art drifted toward acting, chasing praise outside the studio, Paul saw it not as ambition, but as abandonment. Every absence from a key moment, every refusal to return calls, felt like betrayal disguised as independence. And when they reunited, it was never quite the same. Each comeback concert was a reminder not of what had survived, but of what had been lost. The voices still intertwined, yes, but behind them stood years of mistrust and bitterness, making the harmony feel less like instinct and more like choreography. There were long stretches of silence, sometimes years, punctuated by brief reunions that only reopened old wounds. A dinner in Los Angeles ended not in reconciliation but in silence that hung like smoke. A photo shoot in Paris ended with them leaving in separate cars, unable even to share the exit. On stage, Simon would sometimes catch Garfunkel smiling for the crowd and wonder whether it was real or just another mask, like the ones they both wore in their final years together. The illusion of brotherhood remained for the audience, but Simon felt the truth. They weren't singing anymore. They were surviving. What Simon missed most was not the partner but the boy, the friend who once harmonized with him in hallways and basements when music was still discovery and not yet business. He missed the instinct, the way their voices used to find each other naturally, without thought, without strain. That instinct, he believed, had died in the shadows of resentment, suffocated by years of ambition and misunderstanding. In a rare, unguarded moment, Simon admitted the paradox aloud. I loved Art like a brother, and like all brothers, I hated him too. It was the most honest thing he could say about the relationship that had defined his life and haunted it in equal measure. Because beneath the rivalry, beneath the resentment, even beneath the hate, lived something deeper: grief. Not for the fame, not for the missed opportunities, but for a bond that music had created with such purity and life had proven too complicated to protect. For Paul Simon, Art Garfunkel was never just a collaborator or a rival. He was both mirror and ghost, the echo of what had been possible and the silence of what could never be again. Their harmonies may still linger on record, eternal in their perfection, but behind them lies a mourning too wide for melody, the loss of a brotherhood that not even the most beautiful song could save. Lou Reed. If Paul Simon's rivalry with Bob Dylan was built on unspoken dismissals, his brush with Lou Reed was something colder still, a clash not of egos, but of entirely incompatible philosophies. To Simon, music was architecture. He approached songwriting with the precision of a surgeon, carving melodies with balance and symmetry, chiseling lyrics until they glowed with polish. To Reed, that kind of polish was suffocating. The Velvet Underground thrived on abrasion, jagged guitar lines, drone, and noise masquerading as art, or perhaps art masquerading as noise. Where Simon sought harmony, Reed sought friction. Their paths crossed only briefly, but the impressions they left on each other were etched deep. For a short time they even shared a label, though no one would mistake them for peers. Simon recalled those meetings with a kind of frost in his voice. Reed would show up late, always with sunglasses on indoors, posture stiff, arms folded tight as though already bracing for an attack. He carried himself less like a colleague than a skeptic forced into the same room. Conversations were curt, polite only on the surface, with every silence charged with disdain. What Simon noticed most was not Reed's aggression, but his apathy. Once, Reed offered what seemed almost like a confession, though it was barbed as much as it was self-effacing. This is terrible to say. It's really quite mediocre. I think, me included. I really don't feel that I'm much more than, mediocre. For Simon, the words were not humility but theater. He later described Reed's manner as aggressively hollow, as if Lou was performing detachment, daring others to call his bluff. To a craftsman like Simon, it reeked of insincerity. Reed, of course, had his own view. To him, Simon's careful scaffolding of melody and rhyme was antiseptic, drained of danger. He once sneered that Simon's music was music for therapists, and not the good kind. It was not meant as a joke. Reed saw Simon's work as too neat, too safe, too eager to comfort rather than confront. That was Reed's battlefield. Music as confrontation, music that exposed nerves rather than soothing them. They met twice more under dim lighting, each time with the same brittle civility. On the second occasion, the encounter ended with a gesture Simon would never forget. In the middle of Paul's sentence, Reed simply stood, turned, and walked away without acknowledgement, without excuse. No argument, no raised voice, just dismissal so blunt it echoed louder than any insult could. For Simon, who valued respect even in rivalry, it was unforgivable. To Simon, disrespect didn't need volume. It needed only silence, wielded with precision sharp enough to cut. Reed's silence was a blade. Where Dylan's critiques had once left Simon feeling erased, Reed's indifference left him feeling diminished, not as a songwriter but as a presence. There was no duel, no competition, only the brutal reminder that not everyone played by the same rules of courtesy or kinship. What do you think about the musicians that Paul Simon hates? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this, and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.